28 years ago now. My son is 27. My son's name is Soren, named after Soren Kierkegaard. It's that, because I had just been introduced to Kierkegaard, but I was teaching high school at the time. And I had a class of freshmen. So I opened up the possibilities. My wife was pregnant. I said, what do you guys, let's take 5 minutes, baby names, if it's a boy, right? We knew with our daughter was older. We sort of found out accidentally because my wife is tiny and the baby was tiny, so they redid it. We could tell it was a little girl. And our daughter's name was Symphony, so we wanted to have a cool name for a boy, not something like Ian, So there you go, I'm already started, yeah, sorry. No, but, so I said to the class, give me some, so let's just, shoot around, have some ideas. And they were kicking off some ideas, and we were kind of laughing, and then this one student, dead serious, she goes, I really like the name Pubert. and we were all just kind of stunned. And I said, really, Pubert? She goes, yeah, and then one of my other students goes, what do you think his nickname would be? She goes, well, oh, yeah. Yeah, so it wasn't Pubert. So they said, what do you play? I said, well, we have a couple of names, but the one we really like is Soren. And the same student asked her about what do you think his name was. Said, well, you must really want him to get his ass kicked then, right? So yeah, that was what we heard with the name Soren. I said, well, at least it won't be Pubert. But Kierkegaard has been a part of my life for a number of years. I'm not, like I said, probably 30 years. But I have to admit, and I started with a lot of places, or a lot of people do, with Lowey's famous, when Kierkegaard was first translated in English in the 1930s, Lowey did the Short Life of Kierkegaard. And, oh, by the way, so just so you know, it's Kierkegaard, the D is silent, and the double A is like a German umlaut. So it's technically Kierkegaard, but in Danish they just say Kierkegaard. It's that fast. And Soren is like Sun, and it's got the slash through the O. Yeah. So, but I don't say, I don't try and be pompous. I'm used to say, but I do drop the D, right? So it's Kierkegaard. So if you want to be in the know, drop the D. That's how it is. And you can always tell, like reading Kierkegaard. Yeah. No, just yeah. So I'm just so used to saying that. But and then when I went back to school at the age of 32 with my wife and kids kind of in tow, I had the opportunity, the choice of my school, we had one of the top scholars of Kierkegaard in the English language, who now teaches the PhD program in Kierkegaard Studies, one of the few in the country down at Baylor University, C. Stephen Evans. I've read about he's got 20 books out, and he's an engaging, he's actually not a real nice person, but he's just weird. Yeah, he's just an odd guy. He said we could come out to coffee with him anytime, and the first time I went to see him for office hours, he was looking at me and the clock. Mostly at the clock, and so I spent about 30 seconds in there, that was it. Yeah, so. When Dan and Ian asked me to talk about Kierkegaard, and then so I teach a whole course on Kierkegaard, and I usually focus on, his two most philosophical works, Philosophical Fragments, which is 100 pages, and then he thought it would be funny to write a postscript that's 600 pages. And it's called Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments. So those are his response to Hegel. And those are the two that really grabbed onto me. But part of it is, so when they asked me, could you talk about truth, beauty, and goodness in Kierkegaard? And I was like, and he has no one book that encapsulates this philosophy, right? And how do I do all this? I usually spend a semester just going through, and the books I don't even get halfway through. We cover all the ideas, but it's so, and I just thought, I said, nope, yeah, I'm not going to do this. I can't. So a lot of what I've been trying to do is to sort of pare down Kierkegaard's ideas into the notion of truth, beauty, and goodness in a way that is, and I've had to draw from a lot of different sort of text to do this. The other is I'm going to, and whenever I lecture, teach someone, I always am an advocate for them. So even if I disagree with them, I teach a course on Nietzsche, I do the same thing, and I always advocate for them. So the thing about Kierkegaard is his most famous books are all pseudonyms, right? He wrote them under pseudonyms, which means that that's the persona. And so a lot of what we're doing here from fragments and postscript, Johannes Climacus, John the Climber, was not a Christian. He was a seeker, interested, right? But he's coming at this from a perspective of, I'm going to set this thing called Christianity up as a model of scientific inquiry, and we're going to look at it. So so technically, whenever you write about Kierkegaard, you won't say Kierkegaard, you'll say Climacus says, or all his other pseudonyms. So I'm used to doing that, but I'm just going to go with Kierkegaard because that's kind of confusing to switch back and forth his voices. The reason why he wrote that way is part of his philosophy, or part of his theology as well. He wrote that way because he believed in what was called indirect communication. You can never come to faith directly. In other words, you can't present it to someone, you can only offer it and step out of the way, right? Socrates, the midwife. So Socrates there helped to birth ideas, but he never sort of imposed it, this is what you need to believe. So Kierkegaard had the same idea. So his way to do that was to teach pseudonymously. There, I got it. Yeah. So I want to start out with his notion of truth. And please, the way I do this, ask any questions along the way. That's what I prefer. So anything doesn't make sense, or you have an idea, throw it out there. Well, as my students know, I rarely get through a lecture, but I'll try and get through all this. Yeah, and it's because we, and then, but I like it that way. Kierkegaard has. So we're going to start out with truth. Two kinds of truth, but the second kind has two aspects to it. So for Kierkegaard, first is objective truth. And objective truth is just basic correspondence theory, right? It is snowing outside, right? I have an image of snow. I correspond that to my brain. And then, so that's observable, theory. And he also will sometimes call it empirical truth, which is scientific truth, speculative truth, mathematics, logic, and Aristotelian logic, right? The truth. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Just checking, making sure we're all here, yeah. And he never, ever castigates that or disregards objective truth. And this is a tension that is Kierkegaard's often misinterpreted in this way, and we'll get to this in a minute. So objective truth, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but the second type is subjective truth. And this is where it often gets confusing. Kierkegaard's often, he lived from 1811 till 1853? Forgot his, maybe it was 18, I always forget. I know he did his dissertation in 1841, same time Marx did his, so I always remember, yeah, so. I'm drawing a blank on his. Pardon?
55.
55. So it was 1812 to 55.
13. This is what Wikipedia says.
I'm just going to say.
You're smarter than Wikipedia.
No. Yeah.
1813 to 1855.
I get them.
That's all right.
No, it's not. I suck. Let's just so subjective truth, and what he means by this, there's two aspects of it. One is relational, and so subjective truth for him is always relational. So, and I've used this. I'm going to use Peyton again. Peyton's one of my students. So if I say Peyton's my friend, all right. So Peyton is another person, but the friend is that relational aspect. That's what he's always interested in. It's that relationship between me and the object. Where scientific truth, right? It's like 2 + 2 is 4. Or math 2 + 2 is 4. I do have a relationship with that, but it's not in the same way as I encounter another person. And he borrows this from Hegel, right? All truth in this sense is relational. So if I say Peyton's my friend, and then I look at the word friend, and it's this entity, right? Friend is not an object we can see. It's just a word. It's a symbol we give to this type of relation. But if I say I'm a friend to Peyton, but I don't act like it, then it's just, in other words, so that's the idea, is what does that relation mean? Now let's say Peyton and I have never met. That is also a relation. So even if I'm walking down the sidewalk and a stranger comes by, that's my relation, right? I'm not a friend to that person. Stranger could be the word, or however we use that. So he sees everything in terms of relations. And part of that relation is even the relation to oneself. So the way our self-consciousness is a relation of consciousness with its own consciousness, and that's how he talks about that sense of self. So that aspect of it, that relational, is integral in understanding the first half. The second part is, by subjectivity, he means inwardness. And this is where it gets, Kierkegaard is often accused of being the first sort of subjective, relativist, right? I've even read scholars say he's the first postmodernist. He is not. This is born out of the late 80s and 90s. That is not, and they were all reading their own sort of truth is relative. And do you guys all know the anecdote? The only people that believe in relativity, or like moral relativity or truth relativity, are freshman philosophy majors. I told that once to my philosophy class. I'm an affiliate of philosophy, and they didn't think it was funny as I did. But it's true, right? It's like, there is no truth, and usually it's reactionary, right? But no, that's so. And I've had students, say, well, all morals are relative. I said, so is it okay to torture puppies just for fun? Well, no. That sounds like an absolute to me, right? Yeah, exactly. We all have our absolutes. Now we can argue about what those are, and part of the problem is when it comes to truth, many of the things, especially in our religious history, have we've made absolutes that weren't necessarily supposed to be absolutes. So as far that another is more about human preference and desire. So Kierkegaard is often interpreted as that subjective side as being like, oh, it's just what it's yours. It's whatever you believe, and that's never what he means by it. By subjectivity, he always means inwardness, and so, and this is a little tough to unpack, but we'll take them together. So, truth for Kierkegaard, the ultimate truth is inward relation. So that's it. So it's always about how I inwardly, as a person, relate to something else. So he never sees it apart from that aspect of it. So the first relation is always one's relationship to oneself. So and this is the inward part, right? So the first relation is how I open myself up to myself. That's the idea. And Kierkegaard's the way, so all my students know it, right? The first person we lie to? Ourselves. The first lie we tell ourselves?
We don't lie to ourselves.
We don't lie to ourselves, right? So we're always, and so in other words, we all have illusions about ourselves, right? So part of Kierkegaard's sense of inwardness is a continually opening of ourselves to ourselves. So it is the self-knowledge, right? It's somewhat Socrates, know thyself, but Socrates didn't have the Greek word had the Greeks had no word for inwardness. They had soul, but they didn't have a word for consciousness at all. And so it was sort of like that universal we all have an inwardness, but it was much more in line with for Plato the forms, and Plotinus the one, right? But this idea of that personal inward subjectivity comes from Augustine. And Kierkegaard is borrowing from Augustine on this. And Augustine famously said, if you know yourself, and Bonaventure said it as well, if you know yourself, then you automatically are knowing God. Because truth is always an opening yourself up to something. And if God is pure truth, then you're always opening yourself up to God. So theologically, this is how it works for Kierkegaard. And so that's the first relation, is relating ourselves to ourselves. And this will actually come up when we talk about beauty and goodness as well. So that is the most dynamic relation we can have. So that inwardness, and he always talks about ever deepening inwardness. That means continually revealing ourselves to ourselves, allowing, and which takes, and Jean-Paul Sartre is the one who metaphor I like best. He said that type of inwardness takes radical honesty and courage. The courage to be honest, and the honesty to realize when we're not being courageous, right? And the two work back and forth. So no questions, please.
Okay. Well, sorry.
I was just wondering if you could maybe...
You know what? I'm bored already. Let's move on. I can't let him think he's,
Would you be able to sort of like, because I feel like when I hear the word truth, I think I sometimes automatically go to like empiricism.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about truth in relation to how Kierkegaard's relating, he's probably not talking about empirical truth. Right?
No.
So how would you categorize his understanding of truth?
Yeah, what? It's a little unfair to ask me questions. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and that really is a good question because it's... So, and Heidegger who had read Kierkegaard devoutly, uses the same idea that truth I use Heidegger's, truth is always unconcealment. That's his term.
Okay.
So truth, and so the term I'm using for Kierkegaard is openness. He uses inwardness as that, but I'm trying to use other metaphors, right? Heidegger said, so truth is something that you find, you open yourself up to. Yeah, exactly. It's something that is, so if I'm, and this will get into our notion of beauty and goodness. So if I say, Peyton's my friend, but I'm not treating Peyton like a good friend right now, and I say, oh man, I blew it, right? So I realize that about myself. I open myself up to that possibility, and then that is a relationship with truth at that point, right? Mm. And now it's like, I blew it. I got to go, Peyton. I'm so sorry. I blew it. I was not being a good friend. And then that relationship. So that's the truth of it. It's not an objective, an object out there that we simply know, right? It's an opening up to an unconcealing. Yeah, I don't know. Does that help?
I think so. Yeah.
And this is why people who read Kierkegaard on the surface say, subjective truth. It's whatever's your own. It's your own in the sense that it's from inside you, but it's not just. So it's never like, I have my truth and you have your truth, right? So I once walked, and this is when I was,
Sorry.
No.
So is he saying that the truth is the revelation, or that we are continuing revelation to that truth that exists?
Yes.
Okay.
So, it is both, yeah. So Kierkegaard's one, he will say there is an absolute truth, but we don't know it. And that's why he's a little bit sort of postmodern in that sense, right? That, and we'll get to that in a minute, if absolute truth is God. He's the one who introduces God as radically unknowable to the modern world, right? So one of his primary readers was Karl Barth, if we've read any Barth, yeah. So it's a continually opening yourself up to that revelation, and the primary revelation is to continually open yourself up, right? So, yeah, Dan.
I relate almost everything in my life to music, and Charlie Peacock is a musician, awesome, and he has a line that I think, I'm fairly sure he got kind of his own working out of this idea from Kierkegaard, but it's you can only possess what you experience. Truth to be understood must be lived. So truth to be understood must be lived.
Absolutely.
So I think that was really helpful for me.
That's a better. I love that metaphor. Yeah. So truth in this sense is experience, but and I love that. But the reason why I'm always hesitant is because people say, "Well, my experience is the one that matters."
Mm-hmm.
Or it's this is my truth, and you're. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but there is absolute truth.
Absolutely.
The only way to encounter it is by making it non-objective. There is objective truth.
Absolutely.
But the only way to actually encounter it is subjectively.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, perfect. That's it. Yeah. I once walked in, let me tell this story, into a conversation where two students, and I was not a person of faith at this time. One was a devout atheist and the other one was a devout believer, and they were having an argument about the existence of God. And then at one point, I think it was the atheist said, well, I don't believe in God, and that's true for me, and you believe in God, and that's true for you. So God is there for you and not for me. And I said, I said, no, yeah. So I said, actually, that's not how it works. And I said, well, why? I said, that violates, the basic law of Western logic, the law of non-contradiction. Something can't both be A and not A at the same time, And so, so even God doesn't violate this, right? So either God exists or God does not, right? We can't know this for sure. It's an act of faith, right? We can't know this for sure, but both are not true. And so that's the idea of sort of that. He never meant that type of relativity, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Ian, did you have?
Yeah, I was trying to redefine it in my layman's head, and I was thinking when we're talking about like relational truth, is it or being open to it? It always kind of sounds like it's honesty, being honest to your lived experience.
Absolutely.
So like when you say like it's being truthful to recognize you're not being a good friend to somebody, like the truth is in you being honest with that reality
Absolutely.
of the relationship that you have to that person, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. For those of you who know, Kierkegaard was clearly a 4 on the Enneagram. He was, yeah. If you look up famous 4, I'm a 4. This is why. So if you look up famous 4s, it's Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Kafka, Heidegger, all the people that, had, were, there. Yeah. Zach, yeah.
Yeah. So, whenever you were talking about the example of realizing that you are not being a good friend, in order to be truthful, do you also have to explain why you are not being a good friend? Is that like also diving into your own truth?
Yeah. So now whether you explain it to the other person, so that's one of those more psychological things. If explaining that causes more harm, you know what I mean? But if we don't acknowledge why we do, that's part of it, right? Then we're never really living fully in the truth, right? None of us ever are fully open to ourselves, right? Freud said it best in a letter to Einstein. He said, "We must live without our illusions, but we need our illusions to live." None of us. I once had another devout atheist who said, "Jason, I live without illusions." I said, "Oh, I'm sad." I said, "Well, actually, that is one of the biggest illusions, right? Is that I don't live without illusion." So the goal for Kierkegaard, and what we talk about, is that we all look at the world through lenses, right? Through that lens, and the goal is not to live without lenses, but to understand the lens. And so that is part of that, right? So, so if someone says, "Well, I'm sorry," and then the magic word "but," then they haven't really, yeah, exactly. And so part of that, and whenever I teach this stuff, students say, "Jason, how do you do this all the time?" Well, we can't, right? And we'll get to this in a moment. The more sort of reality we face, the more beauty we need, and that's part of that dialectic that we'll get into in a minute. But yeah, that's absolutely it, right? So it's even to be authentic, right? It can say to be truthful, say, "You know what? I need to look at this, but I'm afraid to right now." That's actually a very honest thing to do, entirely, right? Say, "You know what? I'm not ready for that." Or I need to think through this more before I can face it. Yeah, and then you're being honest with yourself, So yeah, and it's always hard. And then you say, "Okay, why?" And then at some point, why am I afraid of this, right? We were just talking about, I think it was last week in class, that one of the hardest things to be, I think that one thing we all crave is to be vulnerable and have someone accept that vulnerability, right? But that's very hard to do. So we always are going to hide, and so and how many of us are radically open with ourselves about our own insecurities and fears? I mean, it's very difficult, right, to do that. Kierkegaard, he called his philosophy a psychology. Matter of fact, Nietzsche was going to travel to Copenhagen to read Kierkegaard because he says, "I'm interested in Kierkegaard's philosophy." We don't know if he read much. There was some translated into German, but not much. Kierkegaard's Danish, if I probably haven't said that already. And he was going to travel in 1889, but if you know Nietzsche's history, that's when he broke down and became mentally ill for the last 11 years of his life. So, but I'll talk about Nietzsche a little more because Nietzsche was familiar with those and was borrowing a lot of those ideas. All right, so do we have that? Truth is inwardness and relation, right? So and that first relation is to ourselves, and then how that pours out to others. Absolutely. So let's talk about. So we have subjective truth as inward relation. So Kierkegaard's subjective truth of Christianity is what he writes a lot about, and this is where he really focuses on in his postscript and then, or in his fragments, and then the postscript to it. Kierkegaard is not interested, and it's hard to explain this, but without sort of overstating it. He's not really interested in the objective truth of Christianity. He gets it. He has a hard time with some of it, but again, it's to his relationship to the truth itself. In other words, one's openness to being itself, right? And in this sense, being itself is God. So he's not. Does one have, in other words, does one have a closed or open relationship to truth? That's his primary thing. But I want to qualify this, as we said, it's not inwardness for inwardness' sake. It's not, oh, just be inward, like, oh, so if I'm, if I'm of a different faith, and he's not really talking about this, but well, he does. He talks about mysticism. He talks about Buddhism. He said they have a sense of inwardness, but that's fine. He said, but that doesn't make you Christian. Inwardness is not an end in and of itself. It doesn't make you Christian. But so not all inwardness is Christianity, but all Christianity is inwardness. Ultimately, he believes, right? So, and he is in this sense, right? He's a Danish Lutheran. He left the Lutheran church because he thought it was corrupt. He became a Church of One, but he is the one who really is a radical romantic individualist in this sense, right? Which is, why a lot of people don't like him as well, but that's a whole other conversation. But in other words, it is that Christianity is always me in relation with truth, and in a sense, the ultimate truth. That's what it is. Not my personal experience. So he never castigates objective truth, as I said. In other words, and this is where Kierkegaard is radically different than the historic Christian tradition. He has very little room for apologetics or for defending the rationality of the faith. And this is where, like I said, it's going to get a little weird. Christianity is not propositional or historic truth that we mentally assent to, and that's what makes us a Christian, right? And he loves the verse in James, right? Even the demons believe that, right? So this idea, and this is where it gets tricky. And Dan and I have talked a little bit about this. So throughout Postscript, he's thinking at this as a scholar, and this is so the reason why this book hit me so hard. When I was 29 years old, I had a previous bachelor's and a master's in theology. I was ordained in a very fundamentalist organization. And for me, faith was all about believing the propositions. And if I didn't believe them anymore, I wasn't, And I was 29 years old, so I was so immersed in all this language and a lot of it really toxic theology. And when that all crumbled, and it crumbled very quickly, I didn't know what to believe, because I was still in this sense that none of this now was objectively true. And so what happened over the next 20 years, and I was an atheist, but I was an agnostic, but usually those are such loaded terms. Agnostic usually means I don't care, even atheist, but I cared deeply, right? This was never a fun. People say, I just left all my church past behind. I don't care. I was like, that was never me. It was a horribly painful experience for years. So I was always grappling, but part of it was I had adopted almost a completely scientific worldview, right? There's just we don't use, in the Bible, when storms come along, it's either a demon or it's the spirit. We don't explain things, And this is true. When Nietzsche said in 1881 that God is dead, and he pulled that from Hegel, it was not a statement of his atheism. It was that we really have no room for God anymore in society, right? With the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, we'd sort of squeezed that out. But Nietzsche's still operating that Christianity is this objective thing you believe in. So Kierkegaard realizes that, and that's what he's trying to get away from, is that it has to be something we mentally assent to. We have to agree to it, and that's, that is the faith experience, and that wasn't it for him. For him, the sticking point is the incarnation. He goes, I cannot objectively believe it. And he never really did, right? So I have to open myself in faith to the possibility that this, could be truth, right? So that's the idea. So what he says, and so when I started reading, especially Postscript, and he has in there, he said, if we think that we're going to come to faith by having more information, more scholarship, more apologetics, more defenses, then we will never get there. You're always going to find one more thing. And this is what I was doing. I read oodles of books on the debate between science and religion, which he thinks is ridiculous. I'll talk about this in a minute. I was trying to read all these things. I was reading, I had a friend who was getting his PhD in physics, so I was reading all these books on physics, and basically, and I've talked to a lot of people, well, but we needed someone to start the whole thing. I said, but if this is our reason to believe in God is because we needed someone to throw the switch, then that's not a basis for faith, for living transformative faith. And I said, I can't buy that. I said, at all. And I didn't, but it was Kierkegaard that, at least, and I was reading him, still not as a person, but it opened me up to that idea of, he said, wait a minute, it's more evidence is not going to convince you. So, and this is what, sorry, just a little bit of my culture, we have so much literature out there in the Christian world defending the faith, and a lot of it's defending the Bible, right, and all these aspects, and I always think, I get it, the need to do that, and that's all this is post-enlightenment, right? We have to make a defense. It's all appealing to that rationality. But Kierkegaard thought this is the death knell of Christianity, of true living faith, whether we agree with that or not. I'm not going after apologetics, but he thought that these discussions will never open someone up, right, to truth.
So quick note.
Yeah.
On that I forgot who it was that said it, but you don't defend the lion. You let the lion out of its cage.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And part of the reason, so this is where he gets to, and he has a whole section on objective truth versus subjective truth. And he said the reason why the science and religion debates don't work is they're working with two different understandings of truth. One is working with objective scientific truth, right? Which you don't have. You can have a relationship to it, but not in the same way. With subjective truth, he said it's not about the objective fact, but opening oneself to it. He said it's equivalent of two teams playing baseball. But whatever team is home team, right? You're playing on their field, their epistemic rules, and it's so they're using bats and a ball, and they're pitching to you though with a bowling ball, and you have a fly swatter. It's a losing battle every day. And if it's reversed, right, it's the same thing. So it's always two ships passing in the night, right? So the metaphor, that sports metaphor, is you're always playing on someone else according to their terms. So it's always being defined scientifically according to objective truth. And Kierkegaard said that will never bring anyone to faith. Yeah. So, and Kierkegaard's famous leap. Have we all heard about Kierkegaard's leap? Yeah. It comes from Lessing, the Enlightenment philosopher, the German Enlightenment philosopher and semi-theologian. And Lessing said, how do I make a decision that takes me from the physical, tangible world into the spiritual world? He said, I cannot make that leap. It's an unbridgeable ditch. It's too far, right? And so Kierkegaard never really advocates for that because that's what it is. But that's what he got that from Lessing. Lessing was saying we can't, these two discussions, it's that they're both working with entirely different paradigms of what is true. And Kierkegaard's the one that unfolds it. Does that make sense? Not that you guys want, am I explaining that okay?
Can you say it again? The leap is from what?
To leap from our temporal world into the non-temporal world. Yeah. So Lessing could not figure out how to do that in his full capacity as a rational Enlightenment thinker. Yeah. And so this becomes Kierkegaard's problem as well. And so it's, you got to take a leap of faith. That's not ever what Kierkegaard meant by that in that sense. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Going back to him thinking of Christianity or faith as assenting to that sort of truth, would he say that participation of ritual or the doing of Christianity is important in that ascension? Does this play into like a sacramentology, or does he have any of that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know the answer fully, but he was he was pretty anti-ritual in that sense. In other words, and these are different modes. So for him, the preparation of the heart, right? He said, I don't think he'd be opposed to ritual, but he was at some point, when is that going to make the heart open, right? You can do all the ritual you want and never have an open heart, right? So that's his idea, yeah. So it's not that he's opposed to it. I mean, the Lutheran Church is still pretty liturgical, for him. But but part of it, he thought that most of the Lutheran ministers were missing this, right? If you do the ritual, then somehow it'll all magically open up, right? He said, no, it has to be an opening up by sheer self-examination, right? Allowing ourselves to be open to that truth. Yeah.
So you just argue in the sense that participating in a sacrament can't be a means to an end to experiencing a religious life. You can't just say, I do these things, therefore I'm inherently religious.
I don't know. So when it comes, Kierkegaard has a lot of religious works. I've mostly only read his philosophy, so I don't know the answer to the question, but I would think he would say it depends, right? If you see that so I'm technically a Catholic, right? So we're very ritualistic, and technically, I'm sort of, but the idea is the sacraments are meant to sort of open us to that possibility, right? Where Protestants are very rational, right? We sort of, it's much more through the thinking, right? And so where Catholics see those icons as a way to open up, Protestants see that a little bit as a barrier. I just think traditionally, not that, yeah. And so, so I think it's part of it is the intention, right? And here we're getting into Jean-Luc Marion, his difference between icon and idol, which is a whole different discussion, but it's beautiful. I probably won't have time to get to it tonight. But yeah, so it's really how we approach something, right? It'd be no different than I need music to help me meditate, if one were to say that, right? It quiets my mind and allows me to look a little deeper. Yeah. So, and if any form of sacrament or icon did that, I think he'd be absolutely okay with that. But if he'd say, well, this is an objective thing that's going to make it happen here subjectively, he says, how does that happen, right? And that's where he tries to say that happens through allowing me to open myself up to myself and to, in that sense. Yeah.
So in that concept of the struggle and opening oneself up, does Kierkegaard have a concept of self that is intellectual as opposed to spirit? Is there a duality person? Or?
Do you have the reading here?
Yeah, I do.
You got to hear this. Yeah, no, you got to hear this for itself. So we're taking a side note because this is. This is the first day or second week of class, right? A human being is a spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self, but what is the self? The self is a relation that relates to itself or to the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but the relations relating itself to itself. That's what he gives us. This is Sickness Unto Death, and it is the only book that he writes as a full Christian, right? So what it is, and that's everything I just described. So a human being is a synthesis of body and spirit, right? So we're immaterial and material. He said, but all that word of relating is relating ourselves back to ourselves. So it is, in other words, a self is, in other words, a human being. It's just like we're immaterial and material. Yeah, that doesn't say anything. It's how I relate that back to myself. In other words, self-consciousness. So all that language of the relation that relates itself back to itself, that relation between the two, and how it thinks back onto itself. So when we flesh this out in class, it all makes sense, right? Yeah, because that's the idea. But that's kind of what he gives us. He's working with, he's using the term relation as both sort of a subject or a verb and a noun. But that's it. So it's everything. So we are, if we're both, we're embodied souls, embodied spirits, right? If we say, but it's how those two communicate to each other, right? Through that relation, right? So even in our very sense of self, we are relational. Yeah, that's how he does it. And then that relational works back on itself through self-reflection. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That starts it, right? And then he develops it from there. Yeah, hold on. Oh, did you have a follow-up question? Gotcha. Does that make? I don't. It's really straight. I usually take 2 whole weeks or 2 whole class periods to discuss just that.
So in some way, then the intellect is the process of relation.
Absolutely, and he defines intellect very broadly as the full spectrum of our capacity. So emotion, intellect, right? Inwardness is making those decisions to open ourselves up to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
I was just gonna say, if he's ultimately getting this all from Augustine, it's just we're made in the image of the Trinity.
That's Augustine,
what's happening,
absolutely.
is like,
Yeah,
You know,
it's relational.
self-relation, opening yourself radically to the other. It's all just sort of reflecting the Trinity.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Kierkegaard, and this is his
Makes sense.
yeah, and that's his tension is the incarnation, right? How do I understand what he can't understand is how the temporal and the eternal come together in one person in that unified way, right? Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, she has an image of it, but in class we talked about the finite and the infinite.
Right.
So the finite would be our physical self, our bodies.
And trapped in time.
Trapped
right?
in time.
Temporal. Yep.
And then the infinite would be the ability to have an imagination, to think about anything.
Absolutely.
And then there's the sort of that connecting line between them, and then the relating itself to itself
Back
is
to itself.
what our self is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, oh my gosh, this is what an art major does. See, finite, infinite. That's a human. Then the relating back to itself is a self. So he distinguishes between a human being and a self. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
'Cause
I should bring you along for props all the time, sis. Yeah.
not to get morbid, but you use the example of someone who was like brain dead. They were human, but they were no longer a self. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, we use the example. Remember Terry Schiavo?
Yep.
We use that example. So she was brain dead, had been for years, right? And so at that point, she was, there was no consciousness at all. I met her brain was dead. Yeah, had been for years. So at that point, and that's where it was very controversial, right? So she was only physically a person, but she was, in that sense, no different. Only the brainstem was working, sending electrical impulses. So she was not technically, she was a living corpse. Yeah, so it was really a strange phenomenon. Yeah. But she had no, because of the brain damage was so extensive. Yeah. So that is. Oh, Isaac. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just had what said over here seemed to click, but it's not really my focus. How does it connect to the Trinity? If you could expand upon that, what you were just talking about.
Yeah, is it the relationality aspect of it?
Well, just like the language in the Augustinian tradition, or with Kierkegaard, about even just subjectivity, or about truth to yourself, to oneself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all in Augustine. That's all a metaphor or an image of the Trinity.
Absolutely, yeah.
The Father, fully, intimately knowing the Son with absolute, self-giving, right? Self-revelation.
It's pure relation.
Pure self-revelation to the Son, and the love, and the openness that they share in the Holy Spirit, etc.
Does that make sense, Isaac? Yeah. It's a great question. Yeah. Where were we? I think final aspect of truth. And Dan, we're already approaching 8 o'clock, and we've just gotten through truth.
Yep. 9 is what we said. 7 to 9.
They don't want to. No one. I don't even want to listen to me.
Whatever you got on. We all want to hear about.
Let's go.
We're all here to hear beauty and goodness about it. But
Right.
whatever you think.
Roll up your sleeves, people.
Yeah. And usually we do an hour and a half, and then questions. But you're doing questions in
Kind of along the way. Yeah.
So
I just. So the final aspect, right? Kierkegaard has been accused, right, by both theologians, philosophers, and scientists of simply having an irrational faith. And so this is a common misconception. Does Kierkegaard then say Christianity is just irrational, and the philosophical term then is, does he just bite the bullet, right? This is where I stand, right? And so we can say emphatically no, but here's, I think, one of my favorite parts. For Kierkegaard, faith is not irrational. It is, and this is not just semantics, it's supra-rational. It's above rationality. And so, how about if I finish the truth part, and then we take a 2-minute break, and then if people want to go on.
Yeah. That's great.
So I could. This is. So it's super rational. It is in other words, it's beyond rationality. In one of my favorite lines, so Kierkegaard, and this is picked up by all the 20th century theologians, from Karl Rahner especially, who was a Heideggerian. Kierkegaard said that, Rahner said that reason always wants to pursue the infinite. This comes from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said, and it's my favorite metaphor, he said, reason wants to shipwreck itself onto the frontier of the unknown. And it's such a gorgeous, and this is one of the things that really clicked with me, right? And so the idea and the unknown is God, and it's not, so that's why God can never be an object of faith in that sense of this is this thing, this entity, it's beyond that, right? God is so completely other, inconceivably so, that all we can do is sort of open ourselves up to God's possibility. And so reason wants to shipwreck itself on the frontier of the unknown. If God is completely incomprehensibly other than reason, logic, proofs, evidence will never get you there. It will never allow you to open yourself up to that. So what he calls inwardness, because it's vague to me, I always use the concept of openness, right? His sense of always, he said, Christianity is always going deeper inward, and for me that means always continually opening ourselves up. So all we can do in faith, not all we do, but the process of faith is opening ourselves up to the other. So it is never, it's not irrational, but it's simply the limitation of how does a finite temporal mind understand the eternal. It just can't. He said that's Lessing's leap, right? We just can't do it. So all we can do is open ourselves up to the possibility of allowing this then. And it's not, oh, this is true, it's allowing us to affect our lives deeply, right? Passionately. So the truth there is then experiential, allowing that openness to God is always his understanding of faith. And as I said, we've spent centuries, really since our post-Enlightenment scientific world, trying to make Christianity objectively credible. And Kierkegaard said that's the wrong argument. How do you take something that is infinite and reduce it down to something that, I can believe that. Right? And this is what the famous Catholic philosopher still alive, Jean-Luc Marion, just absolutely runs with it. It's beautiful, but that is a whole nother lecture. Let me show you the, I'll just read through this, sorry if that's in the way here. And just
We'll cut all this out of the video.
Huh?
We'll cut all that out of the
video. Yeah. When the question about truth is asked objectively, truth is reflected upon objectively as an object to which the knower relates himself. All right, so scientifically, right? Yeah, I know that, and we can use the term knowledge, right? John Locke very famously said, whenever we say we know God, that's the wrong language, right? Because knowledge means to apprehend something in a certain way, and Kierkegaard is borrowing from that. What is reflected upon is not the relation, but that which he relates himself to is the truth. The true, right? So that's objective truth. So if it's snowing outside and I say, oh, it's snowing, I'm now relating myself that, it isn't true. So correspondence theory. It's corresponding, the reality out there is corresponding to the reality in my mind. When the question about truth is asked subjectively, the individual's relation is reflected upon subjectively. If only the how of this relation is in truth, the individual is in truth, even if he in this way were to relate himself to untruth. So even if I believe the wrong thing, there's a very famous statement by, even if I don't have all my theology right? So if I'm objectively wrong something, but I'm opening myself up to the possibility of God, however that is, then I am in truth, even if I objectively sort of don't get it all right. So this is, and it's been somewhat of a controversial, we have to believe the right things, but Kierkegaard is sort of beyond that. That's making belief an objective thing that we have to hold on to. So, and there's been debates on whether he means, well, does this mean that he's, for universalism, and that's a whole other debate. Depends on what view you want to take. But what he's really saying is is that none of us have understand objective truth perfectly, right? And then how do we say we understand something that is beyond comprehension, and so all we can do is open ourselves up to it, even if the way we articulate it might be different than someone else. If you have well, I think God's this way and this God's this way, and they're two opposing concepts, but as long as you're opening yourself up to that, he said, then even in untruth you are in truth. So it's kind of a fascinating idea that way. So, yeah, Dan.
I am far from a Kierkegaard expert. I've read a few things. That's about it. But in his, I think it's later writings, as his convictions regarding Christianity become stronger, which is later in life, if I am right on that.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird journey, but yeah.
He does come to the place of talking a lot about the God-man, and this historical, he kind of maybe reluctantly or very much with this understanding of being paradoxical, which, of course, I mean, Chesterton would agree that it's a paradox.
Right.
Of course, everything's a paradox to Chesterton.
Yeah, everything is. Yep.
but that seems to become and again, I'm asking you to correct me. But it seems like that the incarnation actually does become an important, even historical truth to Kierkegaard that is necessary to kind of and it seems like he kind of puts a further point on that as he moves forward. If I'm
No. So one of his best books on sort of the notion of history of the faith is Fragments, the first volume here, and that's where he talks all about the temporal and the eternal coming together in the God-man.
Yeah.
And so this is where Kierkegaard, there's a little bit of a tension there. He said, we believe the historical accounts that people experience this way, but it can't be something that explained objectively because it doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
And so, and what he said was, and he answers the old question, I wish I would have been there with those people. I would have believed then. He said there were many people that didn't believe.
Right.
So faith is no different now than it was then. They had to open themselves up to it, and we have to open ourselves up to it. Yeah. So he thought the incarnation, it was, and we'll talk after break about contradiction. He did not think it was a contradiction, which is something that can't happen in reality, right? But a paradox, something that's seemingly impossible, but we can't figure it out. And so he, and the problem is, in the early church, especially in the early councils, which when I took my Christology class recently, we had to read all about, the arguments for why, right? He thinks those are, he gets that, but he says that's, explaining those things logically are never going to bring someone to faith.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's his, yeah.
That's one more question on truth. Sorry, I wonder, do you know offhand what Kierkegaard said about Thomism? Because I could see from what you said, and I know nothing about Kierkegaard except what you just shared.
Yeah,
I can see it going one of two ways. Either it's a fool's errand, or every time you take a question and try to really interrogate it, you're opening yourself more into the truth, and so it's worthwhile. Do you know if you have which way you fell on that?
He had very little patience for it, but yes, exactly. For many of the scholastics, because they were relying so much on proof language, right? So, and it was very Aristotelian, right? And Kierkegaard's not against Aristotle. He thinks, but he, and we can actually talk about this if we want to continue after a break. But he saw them. And he understands, at least from what I remember, them working within a particular context. Partly, it's a different ontological context, right? They had a different sense of reality than he does, and that is, I'm actually going to address that after the break. Yeah. So, so he would say what they were doing was appropriate for their ontology, but the ontology really switches. It goes all the way up really through the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment just sort of rejects that, right? But he uses the same rational principles, but everything changes with the Romantics. I mean, everything, yeah. Of which Kierkegaard is, he's sort of a neo-romantic. So, in other words, he's after it, but he was heavily influenced by the German Romantics, especially the Jena group in 1896 to 1796 to 1800, of which Hegel was a part as well. But yeah, so part of that is they're working with two different ontologies. Yeah, Aquinas is working with Aristotelian ontology, and Kierkegaard is working with post-romantic ontology. Yeah, and I'm actually was going to explain that in a little bit. But what should we
I
take?
don't know what that means, so I can't wait for you to explain it.
Oh yeah, no, I will. Sorry, sorry, yeah. Should we take just a little break?
Yeah, break, grab coffee,
And then-
or
and
drink,
let-
whatever you want.
if people want
And
to.
you want to keep.
So, oh, thank you. All right, am I going to be off camera over there?
Yeah.
They don't know. That's all right. They don't need to know. You know, if you don't show up, you don't get it. Yeah, sorry, I just said that. Yeah. So the Hans, this is they in their introduction to Postscript, they have this beautiful statement. So this is what Kierkegaard's sense of the dialectic, right? So the aesthetic and the ethical, these are things that he thinks can't always be reconciled easily. Immediacy, right, and reflection. The individual and the universally human. Time, temporality, right, finite time, and eternity. History as a given and the gaining of personal history. The momentary and the moment. Existential dialectic. The use of freedom, erotic love and ethical love, living poetically and living responsibly, despair and hope, possibility and actuality, choosing immanence and I think I put it as choosing immanence and transcendence, the inner and the outer, concealment and openness, imagination and actuality, thought and actuality, knowledge and action. So all these things you can't combine them. And so in other words, we can't go left and right at the same time. So then I always have students do this, right? No, stop. You can't, watch a movie, you can't go up and down, right? So there are, in other words, what Kierkegaard said, existence itself is contradictory. Some things cannot be reconciled. And so I'm going to, and so for Kierkegaard, this is the basis of reality, that reality, and he means by this existential reality, right? So the reality of my existence is that there are contradictions in my existence, right? And so the best example I can give is Nietzsche, because Kierkegaard says this all over the place. It was hard to find like a good quote. But Nietzsche, in his dissertation, The Birth of Tragedy in 1872, the whole thing is on the competition between two gods for the Greek soul, Apollo and Dionysus. We may be aware of this, already. And so Apollo, right, and Dionysus. And Apollo is the god of, for the Greeks, the god of light, the god of reason, but he's also the god of illusion, right? In other words, if I can't handle things, I go to Apollo to sort of screen me from reality, right? He's the god of video games, or B-grade movies, right? Yeah, exactly. And so he's often, and Nietzsche calls him the god of illusion.
I just want you to know that you just picked a fight with Paul.
Yeah.
I'm with him. Yeah. I love video games and B-grade movies, so I guess
I'm not a, no, yeah. I'm not a gamer, so with authority I can say gaming is stupid. No. Do you know Levi Shelley?
Yes.
He's one of my favorite students. I've had him for a number of times.
He's wonderful.
Oh, he's wonderful. And it was Tuesday, he said, I was making fun of me because Jason, don't worry, I'm just going to go home and play video games and forget about you entirely. So yeah. Oh yeah, he's wonderful. And Dionysus, believe it or not, right, the god of intoxication, the god of vision, but he's actually the god of reality. In the sense of, Nietzsche says, when people get a little drunk and their inhibitions are down, and so I've heard, when their inhibitions are down, right, they're open to reality, right? And it's also, and in that reality, you're open to community. So where Apollo is the god of individuation, Dionysus is the god of community, but also in Nietzsche's mind, reality, and of course the ultimate reality for Nietzsche that you have to face when you're a little inebriated, or is the meaninglessness of life, right? So what we have here is two two understanding, and we all fit within this dialectic, right? Of illusion and reality. None of us live under pure illusion, or we'd be in an asylum. None of us live in pure reality. It's just physically and mentally impossible. So, and there's no such thing as illusory reality or real illusion, right? They can't be synthesized. So this is Nietzsche's dialectic. I always like this one because it's Kierkegaard means the exact same thing by this. So we live, and some days, do we ever have days like, yeah, I can face reality. And other days, you know what, I need to step away. I need to, yeah. And so, and for Nietzsche, the more Dionysus we have in our lives, the more reality, the more beauty we need. And so this is we get into the existential concept of beauty. And so for Kierkegaard, it's relatively the same thing, but this is, so the ontology, right, the understanding of reality, at least as existential reality, and by existences I just mean our existence, is that it is contradictory, right? We're always trapped between two poles. And we all have many dialectics, right? So I have my students, they're working on it right now because we're reading Nietzsche in my lower division class. And they have to understand sort of the primary dialectic in their own lives. And we have many dialectics. And the number one that comes up is my expectations versus others' expectations, right? And if they don't align, they're always going to be contradictory. There's no such thing as, a compromise is that, but it's not, you're still working within that tension. Unless they align, right, our expectations are always going to be different than others, right? And so how do I live? And for a lot of students, it's parental expectations, right? Versus my own expectations. That's not something that can be synthesized. Yeah. It can be compromised where you're sort of like, you're struggling back and forth, but we always exist in that tension. So this is where Kierkegaard would say of Thomas theology that they're not working with that same dialectical structure, right? They felt it, but they explained it in different ways, right? And it was much more about maintaining unity with reality itself.
Can you help me with one other piece of this? 'Cause
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I have a shadow of a memory of an understanding of existentialism, broadly conceived, is that existence precedes essence, right? But I don't remember what that means.
Yeah, that's Sartre's understanding, right? So the idea is that we don't think of reality and that's how it is and let's go and experience it. It's our experience determines reality. So our experience says we're trapped in dialectics. Yeah. So our experience says, oh, I have competing demands that I can't reconcile in my own heart and mind. Yeah. And this is, and this one is what Nietzsche struggled with, and I struggle with it too. Like, there's days like like whole months I have to do a news fast. I just can't do it anymore, right? And I have to. So I need. And I don't know anyone like me. I am it doesn't matter if the glass is half full or empty. It's full of arsenic anyway. So I'm a glass is half empty guy, right? I tend to see like, and I'm a fool, right? So yeah, that's it. So I need, and I need people around. My wife is not this way at all, right? If I would have married someone like me, it would have been over a long time ago, So, I need people around me that give me that sense of, oh, there's so much beauty in the world. There's a lot of awful things as well. But yeah, we're always trapped in that dialectic. Yeah. So existence precedes essence. All that means is that we have to look at the human experience determining our reality rather than just having reality imposed on it. Does that make sense?
I think so, yes.
Sartre says it, and then he explains it better. Simone de Beauvoir, his partner said it even better, but she tries to explain it. Many people think she was the brains behind.
For sure.
Yeah, exactly. But does that help, Paul? Yeah. So all it means is that our human lived experience is what determines our lived reality. Yeah.
So this is going to be a fragmented question, so please forgive me.
No, that's all right.
So, in the glass is half empty kind of thinking, and you need that someone who is the glass is half full, isn't that still a reality? It's just a different kind of reality, or is that in a sense still an illusory idea?
No,
sense?
No, yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good question. So even when I say, like, I tend to be the type that looks too much at reality, like, oh, what's the point, of it all? But even that is under illusions, right? So none of it. And what I need are people that can help me appreciate the other aspect of that reality. Both are real in that sense. And here I don't mean, and you're asking a good question, I don't necessarily mean beauty as illusion at that point, right? But it is, like, if we see something beautiful, if we go to, there's a jazz concert Saturday night, right? I'm thinking about going to the jazz concert, right? So, and it's going to be so beautiful. But while we're there, right, Gaza's still being bombed. Ukraine's still, I'm not trying to be morbid, right? In other words, there is a horrific reality still going on for many lives that are, the children that are going through those lives have just been destroyed, psychologically and emotionally. So, and we don't, so the problem is I can start spinning around in that, right? So that's the idea is, and no one can face that type of reality and still, all the time without encountering beauty. So yeah, so that's what it is. And in that sense it is, going to see music or participating in art, it is not an illusion in the sense of this is phony. It's that it's better that it shields me, at least for a time, from that. Does that make sense?
Is that still using it as illusion, though?
And I'm definitely limited by my vocabulary. So no, it's a
Fair.
good question. Yeah, and it kind of houses. Yeah, I don't see it as illusion at that point. But I do know that I'm looking at that almost intentionally to keep me from looking at that.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Yeah. So, but I can't look at that all the time, right? I also have bills to pay. Or, yeah.
Well, you said earlier that there was a truth in
Yeah.
recognizing that you couldn't face the truth right now.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
so coping mechanisms are also true
It-
and not illusory.
No, they are, as long as we're very honest about doing it.
Doing it.
Yeah, yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, no, absolutely. Like coping mechanism, but when they become so involuntary that we don't see them anymore, that's when they become an untruth. Does that?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Well, go ahead, babe.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like the girl who was like, I'm gonna show up drunk after graduation to go on this trip, right? Because
Yeah.
she wasn't like saying that this is, something
Absolutely.
I'm participating
I was
in.
going to get to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Hold on to that metaphor. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I have to explain it better. Yeah.
Yeah. This is just fascinating, the layers here, right? So I'm thinking about, I just saw Hadestown. And
I heard it's great.
It was great, yeah. It wasn't as good as The Outsiders, but it was good. But Hadestown's great, and yet it's and it is for a time. I'm in a theater. I'm watching something on stage, but it comes back to it's a sad song that we sing over and over again. So there's nothing we can do about it. So let's just raise a cup and try to and imagine a better life. Right. Imagine a better life and drink to whatever we can find to drink to, and kind of get lost a little bit in oblivion, And so it's at the end. We're walking home. My wife and I are walking home. We're like, well, that kind of shattered the whole It reminds you. All it did at first, it's like, we're shielded, and then all of a sudden the shield just crumbles. And that's what I think good art does so often, right?
Absolutely.
Similarly, I saw the Cabaret last year, and Cabaret is, and within the play, that's exactly what they're doing, right? Let's ignore all of the hideous evils. Life's a cabaret, and yet, for the audience watching it, it highlights the evils, and in fact, how insidious it is that it creeps into the cabaret, right? Yeah. And so just the layers of this are just fascinating. There's not a question there. I'm just
absolutely.
And how this thing
So
goes.
what they these are these early existentialists, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the reason why I love them so much, as a historian, I love the beginnings of things. So how they're the first to kind of come up with these ideas of dialectic, but regardless of how we understand the dialectic, and there's many of us, and today we might have 15 of them in our lives that we recognize, and a whole bunch that we don't, right? We're pulled in so many different directions. And these tensions, the idea is not necessarily even how I'm using illusion and reality as a primary one that we all struggle with, right? But the idea is that all our existential realities always lived in tension. And so, and this is vitally important, and that is So Paul, that is the existence determining the essence, right? So existence says we live in tension, and that is sort of the way of reality itself is that tension. I'll finish up here. I have one PowerPoint, but it really doesn't. I can actually explain it better. Hegel thought that the human spirit. Now we're getting into the notion of beauty, and goodness will come in. Hegel thought that the human spirit was at its best when we synthesize everything, we're living in harmony. Kierkegaard said, no, it's the opposite. It's when we live in tension. So the best metaphor I can think of, it comes from Nietzsche in his Beyond Good and Evil. It is, my students know, it's the bow and arrow metaphor. So Nietzsche says, and it's not, and the important thing is that living in tension is not about living in balance, right? It's not being, it's uncomfortable, right? So Nietzsche says the bow and arrow metaphor, you push on the bow and pull on the string. This is not a comfortable position, right? It hurts. So, but then when we string the arrow, and because we live in this tension, we let go, the arrow moves into its future. If we release the tension, right, which is like, I don't want to live in tension anymore, right? This is not a ride we can get off of. That's the existential despair. If we release the tension, right, and we put the arrow in and let go, it just falls to the ground. So what Nietzsche says, and Kierkegaard is Kierkegaard as well, but Nietzsche does that's a better pen. So this dialectic is so these two impulses are pulling on us 100% each, right? And we're in this tension, right? Here's our little dude down here. Sorry, I have a habit. They're always smoking. So the idea is all we can do then, and we don't want to collapse, we can't collapse into either pole, all we can do is move forward. And for Nietzsche, this moving forward through the tension, right, that's his definition of beauty. That's a beautiful life.
Remind me how these three people relate. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel.
So, yes, I didn't explain that very. So Hegel is the one that said all tensions can be synthesized.
Yes.
Yeah. So
before Kierkegaard, like
yeah. So he was dead.
Hegel.
Kierkegaard was 3 when Hegel died. Yes.
Okay.
And most of Kierkegaard's philosophy, when he even talks about the philosopher, it's Hegel. He had a complicated he relies on Hegel, but he hated Hegel's whole system of this. Yeah. And so, but Hegel has been is a phenomenal influence. So Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both reacted to this idea that we can just synthesize things and live harmoniously, that we exist in tension.
And they are contemporaries?
They are 19th century. Sorry. Yeah. Kierkegaard died in 1855 and Nietzsche died in 1900. Yeah. Yeah. But most even contemporary philosophers sort of work with this dialectical structure now.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, good question. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Nietzsche, though, wasn't purely a Kierkegaardian.
No, we think maybe he'd read some fragments, but yeah, no, but he knew enough. He was reacting to Hegel as well.
Okay.
But he seemed to be enough in the air that he was.
So there's a Venn diagram overlap.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. And what it is Kierkegaard gets it from the German Romantics. So does Nietzsche. They're both neo-romantic in that sense. Yeah. So the dialectical struggle of reality, and then as we move through that tension, that's when we begin to encounter a beautiful life, right? A life that's now they define beauty as passionate, engaging, vital, right? All the things that we sort of, what does it mean to live fully? And, all those catchwords, carpe diem, but the idea was to live passionately and fully. And for Nietzsche, it's and for Kierkegaard, never running from that tension, but allowing us to move through it. And for Nietzsche, that's what makes us stronger. And for Kierkegaard, that's what makes us grow. Yeah, that's the idea. And so this is where the beauty and goodness, that is what it means to, and for Kierkegaard, that's what it means to live poetically. That's the beauty. So poetic living is living vitally, and he said, and in fragments, it's inward passion. But the passion is, it's an overused word, but it's to live with purpose and intentionality, through that, but never running from the reality that we exist in tension, and it's uncomfortable. Yeah.
Would running from the tension be denying that it's there?
To a degree, yeah, that'd be living dishonestly, right? But we're all going to run from it. We're like, hey, you ever just want to get off this ride? Yeah, that's all the time, right? It's like but we're never. And of course, Sartre said, even when we're not choosing, we're still choosing. So yeah.
So I'm just going to talk. You tell me if I'm onto something.
No, you go right ahead.
So I this idea of tension and moving and living poetically.
Yeah.
I'm really reminded of sort of the Christian ethical basis, which is to live like Christ. That's the perfect ethical life, right? It's the divinization. Christ, God became like man, so that man may become like God. So we imitate Christ, right? And there's a tension in the figure of Christ between the divine and the human, right? So these two things that are pulling against each other, and then you walk straight through, right? And that leads to the struggle of crucifixion, right? Is that something that kind of ties into Kierkegaard's theology? Is there anything there?
No, it's a good question. One thing that this is a really good question. One thing that Kierkegaard doesn't do that a lot of 20th century theologians do is sort of impose their own existentialism back onto Jesus. Kierkegaard wants to understand that Jesus lived in a different time and culture. So he would say that Jesus struggled with the dialectic even if he probably didn't conceive it in that way, because the culture didn't conceive it in that way. But certainly when you think of the notion of the God-man, of someone who's trapped by a temporal existence, but also, has, however we understand it, whatever to the non-temporal, to the eternal, is living sort of in the embodiment of tension. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? So
Sure.
It's about this dialectic. So, you're describing this sort of either or, it's like, no, it's not the synthesis, it's
Right.
you have to keep them. But the sort of the 100% this and 100% this doesn't seem like an either or. It seems like a both and.
It is.
And
Right.
when you say like 100% this and 100% this, in theological terms, because that's how I think, the guy with the pipe is Jesus.
We just said the guy with the pipe. Did we get? Yeah, exactly.
And so, but it's not as an example of living in the tension. It's the one in whom both things are 100% held together.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah,
So you
that's
see
a good
what
way.
I'm getting
Yeah,
at? So
sure. Yeah.
So then I'm thinking, well, if Kierkegaard isn't going there, if he's just saying no, the tension is the thing that we just have to live between, then is he really more like Derrida, who said, no, the avenir, that's what life is. It's always coming, never arriving.
Right.
Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Is it more like, is he taking it in a Christian way, like a traditional, Christian way, like everything holds together in Jesus? Or, both and?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Or is he like really doing no, we don't synthesize, but we keep them apart? Does that make sense?
No, it's a great question. So, I'll answer a little historically. So the Romantics had two responses to this tension, and it was called closure and non-closure. So, and a lot of them tried to close it, so Hegel did it, but it didn't work out. A lot of them always tried to close the two together, but they couldn't. So so all of us living in that tension, and people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche realized it, is that we can't close them, and that is hard. But the desire to is always there. The desire for unity. I'm not answering your question
I see
exactly.
What you're saying, and I'm just saying, I know that Nietzsche, I'm sure Nietzsche would totally be, we can't close them, but I'm saying Kierkegaard as someone who reconciles everything in the God-man, right, theologically, I'm not saying he would deny the dialectic, I'm saying it is no longer an irreconcilable thing, it's personally reconciled in the person. of
Yeah.
God-man. You see what I'm getting at?
No, no,
At least
absolutely.
that's what, do you know J.G. Hayman?
No.
19th century German philosopher who came out like right after Kierkegaard, I think. He would say like, or there's,
No, I don't
there's
know
a lot
that
of
thing,
other-
no, no.
but like he has this line that Chalcedon is the master key that unlocks the universe,
Oh.
right? And it's just that kind
Right,
of
right,
notion
right,
that like
right.
you do have all of these things that are like total paradoxical kind of realities.
I got you. I got your. I think it. Yeah.
1:17, everything pulls together.
Right. So Kierkegaard would say yes, and he would say that we are, like, in other words, if Christ was fully a self, then it was the two relating themselves back into relation. Absolutely, where we struggle is we're always trying to do that but cannot. But yeah, he would say that in Christ that is, fait accompli. Absolutely, yeah. If that's what you're asking,
I'm saying like because
Yeah.
Nietzsche might say, Jesus was the most tragic example of someone trying to do that, but it could never be done.
And he does say that.
Right.
Jesus is one of his heroes, actually.
And, he's one of the, he'll shout
Right.
into the dark until
Right.
he loses his voice, and that's all great. It's the Avenir thing happening again, right?
Right.
It's like never arriving, always trying.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it seems like Kierkegaard would say, no, Hegel's wrong, but also, I guess, anachronistically, no, Nietzsche's wrong too.
He would, absolutely. No, and I get to do it. So yes, what is accomplished in Christ, he would say, and this is, we can only access through faith. And it is always a becoming, right? It's always that continual opening. And that's why we always have to have that sense of truth, so we are open to that, yeah. But where Christ felt the tension in a way that we can't imagine, right? If we hold to that, to the incarnational theology, we also experience that, but in a diminished way, or because of sin. That's what Kierkegaard says, right? So that's his definition of sin, is right, that is that sense of that human condition in that sense, yeah, of our inability to open ourselves up completely. Yeah, does that make sense?
No, so
Yeah, but no, it's a great question. Yeah, and and this is what is a lot in Postscript, is kind of how he's trying to understand that. Yeah, yeah.
So then, you're talking about seeing the smoking guy as like God, but I think for me, I see it as myself, because with the arrow you're moving forward, and essentially that's like a synthesis, but a synthesis is never the final part. That synthesis is going to become a thesis, right? Which is then going to synthesize with another antithesis.
Hegel did believe that the synthesis ultimately could be the final, right? Mm-hmm. But if it's still imperfect, right, then it becomes the new thesis, and you start over, right? That's right. Where the idea could go on, yeah. But the synthesis can, if you can reach the ideal, which Hegel thought was Germany of his day, right? Yeah. Kant thought all philosophy would end with him. Hegel thought it would all end with Germany. Marx thought it would end with him. The Germans had a bit of a problem. Yeah.
Is Kant the one that never left his tail?
Yeah.
Kant, yeah. Kant never
He had
left.
small man syndrome.
Yeah.
Is it one's purpose to unify the two tensions in the middle, or resist the 100% to each side?
Yes. So the truth is, we're all caught in tension, right? And this is, we all experience this. So the idea is, we can never collapse into either side. So part of the problem with a lot of, at least popular Christian ethics, is, just choose one or choose the other. But it's never that simple, especially when the self is divided against itself, or at least has that conception of we are in tension with ourselves. But yeah, so we're always so Kierkegaard, the despair is our inability to do that. That is existential despair, right? That's why I said, well, you just got to balance the two. There's no balance, right? When both sides are tugging on you, 100%, that's the tension. So the only thing you can do, and to relieve the tension, right, is to move through it. And then once it's relieved, guess what happens? More happens. Yeah, exactly. It's a daily experience. Yeah, Dan. And then, sorry, yeah.
So Yeah, I guess just when you did that, what happens? You torn in two, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Which is that's exactly what when you think of the covenant made with Abraham.
Yeah, yeah.
That with the
Right.
halves of the pieces,
Right.
the animals, right? The halves of the animals, right? Saying, and God saying, "Let this happen to me if this covenant with my people
Right.
fails," right? And which is exactly what happened on the cross, pointing to the cross of Christ's own flesh being.
Yeah, there's
torn.
yeah.
And so there is that tension, and so back to Brandon's point, historically Christians would say, I'm wondering where Kierkegaard lands on this then, would say, well, because, and even back to this knowledge so assent versus, right, there's the three kind of classically, there's the three elements of faith, which is not just the assensus, but first notitia, knowledge, then assensus, assenting to the knowledge, and then fiducia, right? Being willing, if we go to who's the guy that I use this analogy for, and I can't think of his name, but the guy with the wheelbarrow,
Right.
the great
right.
Blondin, right? Who's wheelbarrow going across Niagara Falls and says, okay, who believes I can take a human being across the falls in a barrel,
Right.
a barrel, right, a wheelbarrow, right? And they're like, yeah, we believe you can. And then he says, okay, I need to volunteer. And that's fiducia, right? Is the getting in. So historically, Christian faith is described as being in Christ, and Christ, the idea of the God-man being torn apart by this tension, kind of resolving that tension in an eternal way for us, because not only was he torn apart, but then of course the resurrection and the ascension, right? And if those are who are in Christ, is there a resolution? What would Kierkegaard? How would he approach that? That kind of historic Christian understanding of that, of the tension being solved for those in Christ.
Right, and and this is similar to your.
Yeah, it is
What's your
similar.
name again?
Brandon.
Brandon, gotcha.
Yeah, it makes a finer point on Brandon.
No, absolutely. So, Kierkegaard is in many ways, even though his notion of faith is very radical, his theology is very conventional, very traditional, and he's arguing against German higher criticism of the time. So he's, and so he would, what he says is that in Christ. So he doesn't use the word type. In Christ, the contradiction has been resolved.
Okay.
Yeah.
He does say that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In his
Okay.
in fragments. Yeah. So
Interesting.
yeah. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear, but yeah. So
Yeah.
in other words, in Christ, he said the eternal and the temporal come together
Mm-hmm.
in a way that we can only appropriate by faith. Right.
Okay.
So, yeah. That's
And then the
Absolutely, yeah.
leap to the third
So-
stage then is by. Is that's what leads to that kind of? Or is that,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, and that's so. Yeah, no, he's traditionalist theology that Christ is the completion in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know he was that clear on that.
yeah, oh yeah. So, and I wasn't being clear, probably nearly clear enough. Forgive me for that, but yeah,
No, sorry.
I'm just trying to. Part of it is because Kierkegaard's. He will say that. Okay, this is where it gets a little confusing. But he says, even that saying, we have to be careful, that's not just an objective truth.
Yeah.
That's why I'm being a little careful.
Sure, and then like I know.
So he says that, but this is something we have to open ourselves up to.
Yeah.
Like, I can say that, right? And it's like, no, that's stupid. I don't believe that, right? Objectively.
Right.
But yeah, that's why I'm being a little cautious. Like, did he believe that? Well, he said, in other words, he would say, if this is the reality, right, that Christ does this, then the best we can do is open ourselves up to the possibility of that reality. Yeah, but that's not something we can ever objectively know.
Yeah.
That's where,
Yeah.
and we might disagree with that language, but that's how
Well,
he
he's
would.
mad at his. The only thing what I've read mostly are these little parable things that are pulled out of context. So I'm not even sure.
No.
So
that's
his religious parables, right? And one of them is like, this party is happening up on this. You're familiar with this one? This party is going on up above the alley.
So,
it's on
so this guy here.
So yeah.
So by the way, that is weed. So yeah, just,
so there's a party happening above the alleyway, and the alleyway is where all the poor and homeless are,
Right.
and the party is the church, and they're ignoring what's going on below.
Right.
Or the world's on fire, and the church brings a bunch of squirters, he calls them, basically water gunners.
Right.
And he says, "What are you doing? We need a fire brigade, and you're bringing squirters."
This is why he left the church.
And right, and so and that's what I've read are these little parable pieces mostly, which are
No,
fascinating.
yeah.
But that would make sense then if he's like, you say you believe these things, but what are you how are you living? You can't actually believe them because your life isn't showing you believe them.
His dissertation was on the concept of irony.
Oh.
He hated the church, left the church, but then the church buried him.
And his name means church.
Churchyard.
Churchyard.
Yeah, churchyard. Yeah.
Churchyard.
It's a little funny. Yeah. You had a question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, it was more of here. Is this what you're saying? That for Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, to live poetically is to live with intention while in tension.
Absolutely. Oh, someone write that down. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So I'll finish off with this. It is 9:02. 9:02. To live poetically, and this is one of, I think, Kierkegaard's greatest. Now we get into my one statement on the good, right? But the reason why to live poetically is to live beautifully is also to live well, to live good, right? So, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but it comes from Kierkegaard. What we do is not unimportant, but it is way less important than who we are doing it. So it's not that what we do is unimportant, but who we are as a person, right? That's what really matters. So the example I often will use is two young children are drowning and two men jump in to save them, right? They both do this heroic thing. One wanted to save the child because, right, this child was in trouble and needed to be saved. The other, turns out, is a predator. And he thinks, oh, maybe I can work my way into this child's life, right? Now, maybe it wasn't the total motive, but, so in other words, both do the exact same act. Both do this great thing, but both have two entirely different ways of being as they encounter that act. So for Kierkegaard, it's not that what we do is unimportant, but living beautifully is who we are, why we do it. And that's the good. And that's why we have to have the truth first, right? To be open with ourselves. To live with intention, in the tension. Oh, I am so stealing that. I will footnote you for like a week and then you're just gone. Yeah, absolutely. And then, right, to live beautifully then is to, what does it mean to have that flow into everything we do? Yeah. I don't know, isn't that so cool?
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm so glad